that's much better. I like it already. So I like Finland, I like Helsinki a lot because of two reasons. You probably can guess one of them, but the second one probably not. I like seeing words like this a lot. I'm not sure what is so special about it. I have no idea what it actually means. But the actual fact that it doesn't even fit entirely, well, almost on a regular screen is quite remarkable. So it's pretty good. And then there is other thing that people always drag me into when I'm in Helsinki, and it's of course, for whatever reason, I always end up being in saunas only in Helsinki. Like every single year, I'm 3 times, maybe 4 times in a sauna, and 4 times in Helsinki. So that's kind of weird. But I really love being here, so thanks for having me back. Now, this is me. This is at least how I used to look like back in the day. Things do change over time. I still run Smash Magazine, which is an online magazine for designers and developers. But most of the time these days is not only spent on editing, but also on consulting. So I work a lot with companies, small and big companies, kind of solving different kind of responsive problems with them, be it performance-wise or be it UX-wise. Now, of course, this talk is supposed to be kind of responsive, because it is about responsive design. Now, how responsive could we make it? So I couldn't really decide, should it be more design-focused or should it be technical? So you tell me, should this talk be more technical or more design-focused? So who is more for technical? Who is more for design? And what am I supposed to do now? That's interesting, okay. Well, I'll say I will be jumping a little bit. Because I guess there is it's a great thing to actually have kind of both sides confirmed, kind of combined, because we will be kind of covering both topics. Because I think it's really critical when we talk about responsive design, is actually to stop thinking about designing websites, to start thinking about designing pages, because we have to become a bit more holistic about it. Now, you might have heard these terms, designing systems, atomic design, pattern libraries, style guides, right? How many of you have heard of them before? How many of you are actively implementing them in real projects? Like 1.1%? All right. Now, the reason being is that it's very difficult to get it right in real projects. And I think there is a way to actually make it right. So let's cover that. Because actually, I think it would be interesting to kind of cover our workflow and our process, because when I'm brought in the company, we don't have a lot of time to spend. We have maybe 5 to 6 days to produce functional prototypes in a responsive project. And it really forces us to be efficient when we do this stuff. So we kind of figure out a way, and I'm sure that you will not like it, and that's okay. That's a safe place, but maybe some of the thoughts and ideas I'm going to propose will be applicable to your work too. Now, before we do that, let me go back in time a little bit to this fantastic masterpiece from 1893. Now, some of you might be familiar with it. It's probably one of the most important artifacts of human-machine interaction back from the 19th century. It's a first issue of the so-called Illustrated Phonographic World, dedicated entirely to the so-called type art, or the art of producing artworks like this with characters, very much like ASCII art as we know it today, right? And at the time, of course, people got outraged. Why would he misuse this fantastic piece of technology, which was a typewriter at the time, to create stuff like this? It's actually very much like what we see today when we see things like, I don't know, Homer Simpsons in CSS, right? We ask ourselves why. Why does it exist? What is the purpose, right? Well, I kind of like it because it really forces us to think beyond what we think is possible. Because this was the beginning of an era, right? At the time it was an outcry, but then it evolved. This is the Bauhaus time of the type art, right? And it kept evolving up until 1939, when Julius Nelson tried to collect all kind of different patterns that would be used in art typing, in his book called Art Typing. And it started very, very small, right, with a few lines. Now, everybody can draw a line like this. That's not a big deal, right? But once you know that, you can actually keep evolving and design more refined lines, and more refined lines, and frames, and at some point, of course, a goldfish and a human, right? And at some point, because it's so boring, a gradient and a human face. Now, we're talking a lot about CSS gradients. Now, that is a gradient. And it compresses really well, right, as well. So that's important. That was important at the time. And then it got more complicated, and so on and so forth. Now, what's really interesting about this, and which kind of brings me to responsive design, is that eventually it brought us something remarkable, something that you hopefully still enjoy and love every single day, which of course is Teletext. How many of you are familiar with Teletext? How many of you still use Teletext? A few people. That's pretty cool. I'm a big fan of Teletext. For those of you who are really into it, Teletext has been discontinued in the UK, which is a shame. But there is a conference happening right now in Iceland on Teletext 2. So if you're into this, you can look into it. But this was a big deal, right? Because it has its origin back in 1893, where everybody was starting actually experimenting with type characters, right? And if you look into it, that's not very different from what we have to deal with today. Now, what we have here is a box with content in it, right? We have navigation, we have logo, we have colors, we have a grid, we have some kind of typography, which is very similar to what we have to do today, right? Now, obviously, the method of using this system is very different. And for those of you who do not know how Teletext works, like on a TV, please, if you're a neighbor and you know how it works, please tell so. But it was, of course, a bit different, but we still have a very similar experience today. Now, this is one of the first Teletext pages, and this is how it was supposed to be used. You're punching numbers, and you're getting from a page to a page. Very much like links, which we do, go from one to another with clicking or tapping, just a little bit different. Now, while we're thinking about people using Teletext, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about people designing Teletext, right? Because every single day, those poor people, really poor people, were sitting in the newsrooms pushing pixels one by one. We talk about us being pushing pixels. No. We select pixels and move them. They were literally pushing pixels in this damn machine, right? And it was like 600-700 pages at a time every single day. And then it got more complicated because color kicked in, right? So it really exploded this complexity of designing Teletext pages. So it has become an incredibly complex thing. But still people are doing this, and of course it has become more and more evolved over time. But eventually, and this is kind of the main point, it brought us a really important tool which those Teletext designers were using back in the time to design these Teletext pages. Now, before that, they would need to create those pages manually, right? With this tool, they were able to define presets and define colors and define grid and define certain templates that they could be reusing then later on when they need to create the Teletext page. Now, I'm really confident that if we didn't have the web today, most of us would definitely be Teletext designers and developers, right? Because it was a big deal. And this is probably the ultimate pattern library or style guide, if you like, from back in the day. Now, how is it related to responsive design? Now, on the web, we have a different box. We have a box, and we still fill it with content, right? In fact, we have many boxes inside boxes because we're developers, right? So we see boxes everywhere, and our job is to kind of align those boxes to ensure that a system that we create scales up and down. And these boxes can be versatile and finish at times, right? But it's still the same thing, which is why we have this kind of global understanding of what responsive design looks like, right? It's just a set of boxes, which I think is fundamentally wrong. Because when I think about responsive design, I think about this quote by Tim Brown, who said that designing for the web is like visualizing a tesseract. Tesseract is a complex hypercube. We build experiences by manipulating their shadows, right? Shadows. So when we think about responsive design, maybe we should be thinking about systems like this, where every single day when we make a design decision or a development decision, doesn't matter what it is, we need to put just the right dot in just the right place across all of those dimensions like navigation, accessibility, performance, typography, and so on and so forth, right? Which is why it's so incredibly complex, and which is why many clients don't get it. So you end up with this in many projects. Not sure about you, but this is totally true in many of the projects I'm working on. And this brings us, of course, to mobile apps because they're a little bit more predictable. But I really love this quote by Greg Hoy. The CNN iOS app is so bad, I took the unprecedented steps of deleting it and reinstalling it just so I could delete it again, right? Because there are so many badly designed apps out there. Now, why is it then so complex? Why is responsive design so unpredictable? Well, because it's really just complex. So you have many different things to keep in mind. Components like flexible grid navigation, form controls, carousels, accordions, drop-downs, pagination, media lists, thumbnails, graphs, charts, third-party content, iframes, type tables, and data grids, just to name a few. We also have to be strategic about what the hell we're building in terms of responsive images. Technically, easily solvable, but if you're running an e-commerce site with lots of thumbnails and lots of product images, somebody has to create these images first, so these people have to be trained. That's a lot of work. Also, legacy browser support. Now we have smart browsers, stupid browsers, and we have Opera Mini, right? So we have to figure out a way, what are we going to do with this kind of new breed of proxy browsers, performance, and so on and so forth. And that's not it, because at some point we do have to think about layouts too, right? This is kind of what we have to build. Homepage layout, undirected features, and so on and so forth. Now this is complex. And this is why if you're going to a party and somebody asks you what you do for a living, you can pretty much say that you're a Superman or Superwoman. Because keeping all of that in mind at the same time is really, really hard. And it's really easy to get it wrong. So you need a system in place to create design systems. My system is atomic design, but when I talk about atomic design, that many of you probably have heard of before, I'm not talking about technical implementation in terms of templating. Because in many degrees, atomic design is about templating, modules into modules into modules. I talk about it from a design perspective. So let me just quickly recap what it actually means. It's very simple. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it kind of changes the way you design and build. So atomic design has 5 stages: atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. Now, when we start designing, we don't go to Photoshop and create a huge canvas of, I don't know, not huge, 1200 pixels times 1000 pixels to design a page, but instead we go to Photoshop or whatever tool we're using, it doesn't matter, and we create a new canvas of 5000 pixels times 5000 pixels and start designing small components first. Now, atoms are the smallest units we have on the web. Think about things like buttons or labels or input fields, right? Now, we can't separate the button into half a button. It's just not how it works, even with JavaScript, right? It just doesn't work this way. But we can combine atoms and create molecules, can combine molecules and create organisms, we can combine organisms, create templates, and then add real content, as we will see, and actually get a page, right? So this is an example, very simple example. We have a label, have an input, and a button, which are our atoms. We combine them and create molecule, like a search box. Multiple molecules brought together create an organism like this, which has a logo and a navigation and a search box. Multiple organisms brought together create a template, which looks like a wireframe, if you like. And then you add real content, and you have your page. But the most important thing is, of course, that the page occurs at the very end of the process. It's not something we are starting with, it's something we are finishing with, right? Which is fundamentally different. So again, you're going to Photoshop, and you create this huge canvas, 5000 pixels times 5000 pixels, and you start designing modules. Because if you design modules, you can kind of enforce consistency, which you can't do with pages. And of course, I know what you're thinking. Well, if we're thinking about components or modules, we probably are thinking about style guides and pattern libraries, things like that. Now, what is it? It's just one page, which serves as a great reference. We have all the different components with screenshots, with HTML, CSS in them, sometimes even usage notes about how to use them. So if somebody needs a specific component, let's say a carousel or navigation or whatever, they can just copy-paste the code and get it done the proper way without having inline styles and things like that. That's very cool, of course, but this is probably not something you will be starting your project with. I mean, I can't design a button over there and a label over here and then a form over there and then put it all together and call it design. I kind of need a big picture, right? I can't just design that small. And the same goes for frameworks like Foundation or Twitter Bootstrap, right? I can't just take Twitter Bootstrap, pick a few components I need, skin them, put them together and call them design. At least for me, it's just not how it works. I need to see a bigger picture first. So when we start designing, we do something slightly different. Now, I'm editor at Smashing Magazine, so the most comfortable tool that I'm using every single day for many years now is a text editor. So when we start designing, we obviously have a conversation with the client. We start listening about what the problem we are going to solve, and then we jump into text editor first, which we call writing first design. So we actually design in a text editor to understand and formulate goals, objectives, and the language of a project. So we have a conversation with the client, we take notes, we try to understand what we have to do, and then we try to translate those words into an actual text editors in an interface copy, right? So this is a very quick sketch of a website, if you like, right? This is a headline. This is a navigation. You can define primary actions and secondary actions. Here is your account dashboard. You define the language that you're going to use. The same goes for different kind of functions and so on that you have. You can even have micro interactions. This is a light box, which is prototyped, if you like, in 5 seconds, right? You don't have to pull a library for this. You can just prototype it right away. And then, of course, the reason why you're doing this is mostly to get a really good understanding of what you have to build. And also an understanding of what components you need to build before spending too much time on designing and building them, right? Does it make sense? Who wants to leave at this point? Okay. All right. All right, that's fine. That's fine. And of course, at some point, you will do things like card sorting, and you will have things like sketching, where you just sketch an interface, but it won't be a high-fidelity sketch. It will be something just to kind of manifest an idea we want to follow. So we start with a text editor to get to the core of the language we want to use. Afterwards, we actually do try to avoid Photoshop as much as we can. Now, I think that Photoshop has its value, of course. But when it comes to responsive design, this is where you're losing time. If you need to send 2 or 3 sketches or mockups to your client, this is where you're losing time, because you have to actually design them, right? So what we do instead is what we call visual inventories, where we try to kind of decide on the visual direction without spending too much time on those deadlift mockups, right? So this is what it could look like. Just a PDF that you send to a client. We have a gallery of different screenshots of different sites that we just pick to kind of select a direction together with the client, right? So, dear client, maybe you'd like something like this, with a big typography and a few product images on the top, right? Or maybe something like this, like Bloomberg.com, right? Where you have a lot of, very much like material design, if you like, but lots of different tiles and lots of different colors. Or maybe something like this, geometric and out of space, or maybe something colorful and spacey and circular like this, right? So you show this, and the best thing you can do, actually, to really get a clear understanding whether your client can identify themselves with this design, is to put their logo in it, to Photoshop it in, right? Again, all of these screenshots are just screenshots of sites we found, or we know, or we have, right? And you Photoshop it in, and then the client will tell you if they like this direction or not. And you don't have to go ahead and design a navigation bar first, and design the actual layout first, and the footer and everything, because you can show this. Now, why is it so important to actually try to avoid pages? I think because whenever we start the conversation about pages, it's always a trap. Whenever you start designing a page, you have to think about what goes on the page, obviously. But then when you do that, you have to figure out what components go on the page, and also what behavior these components are going to have. Because obviously, these components have to be responsive, right? So you need to show this responsiveness. So which means you have to design not only one mockup, but at least 2, the mobile one and the desktop one. But then how can you do this if you don't know the grid yet, and you don't know the breakpoints yet, and you don't know, very often, you don't even know the content yet, right? Now, this is a problem, but showing this, you avoid the entire thing, and this really boosts up your performance in terms of actually designing and building. So you show this, and you have a conversation with the client, and you can decide on the visual direction. At least you can know or find out what they like and what they really don't like. And then you start designing these components. Again, not a page, but components. You know that your site is going to be dedicated to a specific topic. So think about the components that will definitely go on this page. In this case, it's a donate to Reading is Fundamental, which is a project dedicated to reading, to kind of encouraging kids to read. And here what you can do is, well, we will need some donate buttons, and we will need actual donation form. So let's design it first. And then you keep going, and then you keep designing more components. And then, at some point, you create the so-called project hub, which is one central place with one URL with all important assets sorted chronologically. This is what it could look like, where you have one page, again, with one URL that has all the important things: performance results, metrics, usability tests, videos, any notes from the client, whatever. So they actually can go to this page probably, well, any time they want and get an update of what's going on. And it's all listed chronologically, so the newest things are always on the top, and the oldest are always at the bottom. And then what you do when you start your project is designing those little components first. Now, they don't have to be that small, as I showed before. They can be bigger. But what you basically start with is actually designing these components in Photoshop, right? And this is a big image just exported from Photoshop, which contains all kinds of different components that will eventually go on a page, right? And this is what you're showing to the client. Sometimes they will like it, sometimes they will hate it. But when they hate it, because internally you still follow this process, you can mock up a page, if they like, relatively quickly. It's not going to be a complete page, but you can create a mock-up really quickly if you have enough components in place. So you show this to the client, and at some point you get some feedback, and you keep refining, and you keep refining, and you keep refining until you have enough components that you can actually start prototyping, right? So that you can actually start building a page. But just before you do that, it's really critical to have a clear understanding about the budgets that you have. Now, how many of you have heard of the term performance budget before? How many of you have heard of the term UX budget before? Okay, so budgets in general are really, really important. Now, I kind of like constraints because they really force me to be creative. And I like constraints pretty much in everything, be it performance or UX or anything else. Now, let's talk about performance first. Performance budgets help us define precise constraints to work within and hence avoid unexpected costs down the road. Now, what do I mean by saying that? Now, usually when we think about performance, we think about edge cases, like this, right? Now, this is obviously an edge case. I don't know how many of you have noticed this. Well, I don't even know if it's fake or not. But what is really true is that the designers of this, table or view did not predict that the score is going to be that high, so they were not, ready for this. This is an edge case. Now, on the web, we have slightly different edge case. We might say that we tend to be really fast. And in some areas, we are sometimes, right? But in many scenarios, even although we have a 4G subscription, we are still on 3G. Now, I really care about performance, and I really, really, really care about performance. So I did a little experiment. Now, obviously, you don't want to end up with invoices like this for roaming charges at the end of the month, right? At least I don't want to. But you will if you are on roaming a lot. So I'm using T-Mobile, and T-Mobile differentiates countries into 3 groups. Friendly countries, not so friendly countries, and really not friendly countries. So if you're in a friendly country, like Finland, for example, you're going to pay for roaming 53 cents, euro cents per megabyte of data. That's acceptable. I would say it's expensive, but it's acceptable. But if you happen to be in one of those countries, in the really not friendly countries, you're going to pay 79 euro cents per 50 kilobyte of data. Now, to visualize it, if you want, okay, I went to Russia last year. Can you guess in which group Russia is? Everybody silently guesses. That's all right. That's cool. Now, Russia is, of course, in group number 3. So if you go to Moscow and you want to load the full front page of Vogue using roaming charges, you're going to pay 93 euros and 13 cents just to see one full front page of Vogue.co.uk. And this is, of course, because they are loading Retina images and JavaScript and web fonts in the header of the page, right? This is wonderful. But my problem with it is that for the same amount of money, you can get 16 print editions of Vogue in Moscow, right? So this doesn't really make sense. Now, of course, I lied at this point, because if you read in German here, in the 3rd column, it kind of said that the connection is going to be interrupted automatically once you reach 5950. Now, here's the trick. Because they're loading all of the fancy stuff like JavaScript and so on at the header of the page, I'm going to pay 5950 for seeing just a little bit of the header at the top. Right? And then the connection is going to be interrupted. Now, this is not cool. So this is why having a performance budget is, I think, really, really critical. Now, many people in the design process just don't know a lot about performance consequences. So we put all of the fancy stuff, like huge web fonts and huge images and so on and so forth, unless we actually think about it up front. Performance budget basically is just a budget on your side on how fast your site is supposed to be, right? So you could say, well, I want at most 20 HTTP requests, or I want at most 750 kilobyte for the front page, or whatever. But what is more useful, of course, is to say something like this. I want the page to start render under 1.1 second on DSL 16,000 from Helsinki, or under 2 seconds on 3G from Helsinki. Yeah? So this is your goal. And whatever you do, you have to make this goal right. So your design decisions will have to go through the lens of performance every single time you design something. And it has a tremendous influence on the amount of fonts you're going to use, on the amount of images you're going to show, and also the amount of JavaScript you're going to use, right? So this is really, really critical. If you want to be fast, you have to respect this, right? And then, of course, if you need to add something fancy, like a retina carousel, for example, well, it has to go through this lens of performance budget, where you say, well, you have 3 options. You either optimize a new feature to fit the budget, right? But especially when it comes to carousels, it might be really hard. Or you remove an existing feature, but nobody wants to do it because you just built one. Why would you want to remove it, right? Or you just don't add the new feature. And in my experience, the last option works like charm every single time. So things that don't have to be on the web, right? And nobody wants to be slower than the competitors. So you look at your competitors and you look how they perform in terms of actual performance. And it could be start render time or full loading time, but start render time is more critical. So you look into the metrics of how fast they are, and then you want to undercut them. And there is a study by Stephen Shaw who found out that if you want to be faster than your competitors, or to be specific, if you want your customers to see that you are faster than your competitor, you have to be at least 20% faster, right? So you have the metrics from your competitor, shave off 20%, and this is your goal. And this is not going to be easy, right? But the best part is that even if your site is extremely bloated and has a lot of images and a lot of JavaScript, you can still make it load fast, right? You can't make it the entire site load fast, but you can start render within 1 second for any given website, unless you use Angular and client-side rendering. But this should be your goal, right? There is actually a nice article by Dan Moll kind of covering how to make a performance budget. But this is the main goal. And you can do this for performance, but you can also do it for content or UX. So here, for example, we use this core priority list to figure out what is critical and what is not critical from the business perspective and from the user experience perspective. Now, if you ask your client, dear client, we have the content on your site, what is really important on your site? What will they tell you? They will tell you that everything is important, right? But this doesn't get you anywhere. So what we do is we set a spreadsheet where we list different topics or different articles on the page or on the site, and then we highlight the ones that we feel are important, right? Now, if the client thinks that they're not important or less important or more important, they will let us know. But what we ask them to do is to mark whether it's of primary importance, secondary importance, or maybe tertiary importance, right? Now, most of the time, of course, they will set most things on primary, right? But then, even then, it helps, because all the things that they set on primary to me, means important. Everything that's secondary, to me, means not important. But for them, everything is important, right? So I kind of at least get a sense of what is important, right? And we actually also do it for UX, where it means, well, let's identify really critical tasks, like a checkout, right? So we have this metric. How much time should the user spend at most to still feel happy in the checkout process? 20 seconds, 35 seconds, 45 seconds, depends, right? So this is where you're going to do your user research to figure out. But we say, all right, 30 seconds is our threshold. So we have to do something after 30 seconds. What could it be? Well, what we decided to do, and we were kind of, please don't misuse it, if you can. What we decided to do is, if we know that the user has spent in the session more than 35 seconds, then we pop up a little pop-up saying, we know it's painful, and we know it's the experience, checkout experience isn't, perfect, but if you move on and actually finish the checkout, you'll get 5% or $5 off on this very purchase, right? 100% conversion rate. Because at this point, when we actually have 35 seconds have passed, people are maybe 75, 80% finished already, right? So the last 20% will be done if you just give them a little push, right? So you can identify these critical tasks, the UX budgets, and figure out what you're going to do when this threshold is reached, right? So again, the idea of performance budgets, I think, is really, really critical and really useful in many degrees. We even do it for things like this. Sometimes, if it's boring and you feel like, okay, 35 seconds are gone, we need to do something, well, maybe you can actually make your slider a little bit fancier, right? This will at least distract the user, right? So this kind of thing. Or it could look like this. Isn't it beautiful? Okay, just me. That's okay. I'm a crazy person. I'm used to that, right? So, right. But of course, what do we have? Again, we decide upon designing these little molecules first, these little components first. Then at some point, we have a conversation about performance budgets to figure out, okay, what are our constraints? Because they will define how many fonts we can use, how many JavaScripts we can use, how many images we can use, whether we can use a carousel or not, and so on and so forth. But at some point, of course, we have to start prototyping, right? And we always prototype with a pattern library in mind. Now, when we have everything in terms of a visual design already cleared up, we pick a page. Definitely not the home page, because you know why? It's going to ruin everything. But an important page. If it's a magazine, we're probably going to pick an article page. If it's an e-commerce site, we're probably going to pick a product page or maybe a checkout page, right? And we start prototyping this page, because we do have components that we designed for it. And we do it with pattern libraries in mind. Now, a pattern library is important because it establishes a shared design vocabulary, and it also enhances consistency and maintainability of a project. How many of you, be it designers or developers, have seen something like this, right? A designer being really desperate to send something very specific as a mock-up to a developer just to make sure that the developer doesn't get things wrong, right? Sometimes designers even write almost CSS in here just to be sure that the developer doesn't get creative with the mock-up, right? Because nobody wants developer to be creative, right? It's a bad joke, I'm sorry, right? So you see things like this, which are really tiresome to do. They take a lot of time. And think about, sending mockups like this to a developer, like 5, 6, 7 mockups like this for every single page, with the guides and with the spacing and with the margin, like to be really precise about what you have to do. So we've been thinking about something different for a while. So what if we can avoid this altogether? So when we design, when we build, we could be sending something like this instead, right? You just take a piece of paper, and you start designing on the paper. And because all of the components have names, and potentially have rules established between them, what a designer could be giving to developer is not this huge Photoshop mockup, but just a napkin with a design on it. Would it be possible? So here's what it could look like. Of course, in order to make it happen, to kind of move away from this deliverables that we used to have in the past towards something a bit simpler as a napkin, well, we need to establish a sense of modularity in the team. And for that, we need 3 parts: vocabulary, grammar, and language. And they're much simpler than they sound, because what we can do is just talk about components. So let's take a look at them. Vocabulary. We need to discover and define a shared vocabulary for the modules we have designed. So let's say we have the modules like this, right? We have an intro, we have an outro, we have a core module, we have a hero, we have a bridge, right? Different kind of modules, we just give them names. Now, giving names is really, really important, because in most projects I was working on, you end up talking about things like, remember that component in the left upper corner, which was next to the logo, but 10 pixels off? This is the name of that component, right? So everybody is talking, remember that component, But if you give it name, then everybody knows what is actually meant, right? So we're giving proper names, and different names. Bridges, helpers, and also, as you will see in a second, we establish rules between them, right? Again, we start designing with these components in mind. And what we do then is identifying patterns first, designing modules, naming them, and making them visible and established throughout the team. Now, it's not just something that designers take care of. It's not just something that developers take care of, right? It's something that is a shared vocabulary within the entire team. So, for example, if you know SMAX, right? If you're a front-end developer, well, it will be base layout module state theme. Maybe it will be more refined than that, right? If you're a designer, it could be something like intros, outros, core, heroes, bridges, helpers, and so on, right? Once we have this vocabulary in place, we can define grammar, which is basically just simple rules on how parts fit together, right? And it could be as simple as this. So if we have a bridge, well, it always appears between two modules, because it's supposed to bridge two modules, right? If it's a helper, it never appears after bridges, and it always appears near or next to a component that we just assigned. Vertical spacing for a module is always proportional to the line height of the base font size. Horizontal spacing between modules is always 2 columns plus gutter within the responsive grid, right? So there is no need then for a designer to go into Photoshop and really carefully design all the spacing to ensure that it's just right. Because if these rules apply to every page, they will apply to every page. So it's kind of consistency that you have in your system. And sometimes designers go even further and create those responsive layout behavior diagrams. Again, you identify different components, just a simple example. And then you also create a few artificial breakpoints. Now, of course, before you prototype, you don't know your breakpoints yet. But here you just say, well, let's think about XS, small, medium, large, X large, and XX large. 6 artificial breakpoints. It doesn't mean we're going to use 6 breakpoints in our design, but it means that we will talk about responsive behavior without having to design Photoshop mockups, right? So if you are, for example, this component is going to be stacked between XS and small, and it's going to be 2 column between medium and XX large, right? So it kind of manifests specific design decisions, designer and developer together, right? Without having to design too much, right? And this can happen in a browser, right? It doesn't have to be in Photoshop. And of course, XS is something very, very small, like a mobile device, really tiny mobile device. And XX large is something like a really large TV screen. And everything in between would be everything in between, right? So in between medium and large, you have this break, transition from tablet to desktop, right? But sometimes it might be too abstract. Sometimes it might be really, really useful. But if you have this, there is just no way for a developer to get things done wrong. It's just not possible, because the designer and developer work together to work out through this document together, right? Now, sometimes, of course, you don't have time, so you have to prototype quickly. In that case, we're using this spreadsheet, style guide and boilerplate pattern spreadsheet, which contains on the left side lots of different components, I think 150 of them or so, starting from very basic, like spacing, to something really advanced like international phone input. You don't want to design it or to build it from scratch. And on the right here, you've got Bootstrap, Foundation, and all the popular frameworks, and so on and so forth. So if you need a specific component but don't have time to prototype it, well, you can just search for it and look how many frameworks have it, and then pick the one that you know, for example, right? And then you can skin it and really have a prototype within minutes, right? So complex things like payment or credit card input field with all the regular expressions and so on doesn't have to be written from scratch, right? You can just grab it and apply it right away. And sometimes we would also use style guides IO if we don't find what we need, right? So I have to jump a little bit. Right. So in the end then, once you have vocabulary and once you have a grammar, you basically have a language in place. So your design process is not anymore designing Photoshop mockups one by one, but actually assembling components that you already have, right? So you keep assembling. Because everything is modular, when you put things together, you actually create a design. So it's not something you create page by page basis, but something you create module by module basis when putting things together. And of course, pattern library, or one page with lots of different components on it, cannot exist in isolation. It can't be something that you give to somebody who really cares about style guides and make it their job. It's not how it works in my experience. It just doesn't work. Everything has to go through the pattern library. It has to be a part of the build process. So I know that many of you are using Grunt or Gulp and so on and so forth. But whatever you're using, you should be, well, it would be a good idea to kind of encourage consistency, to think about pattern libraries in every step throughout the way. So that ownership lies not within one person dedicated to a pattern library, but within the entire team. What do I mean by that? If you have to do extra work to update your style guide when making changes to a look and feel, the likelihood of staying up to date is pretty slim. So in every single project. How many of you have encountered that? You build a nice pattern library, and then 6 months later, nobody maintains it, it's out of date, it's totally useless, right? In order to fix it, we can use tools like Living Style Guide, or KSS, or Style Doco, or RubyGem, Living Style Guide RubyGem, or Pattern Lab even, which all work similarly but do have differences. Where as you start prototyping, that page, right? You actually write for every specific component that you built. You also write a bit of documentation, right? Including the usage notes and the hints and the different states for this component and so on and so forth. And you have this tool which runs Phantom.js, which actually runs a headless WebKit browser and then takes a screenshot of that component and puts this on this pattern library, right? So this pattern library is not something you have to maintain. It's a living style guide, which means it lives in your code. So every single time you deploy or commit, right, it's going to be automatically generated for you. So you don't really have to maintain it as long as you write documentation, which is, as we know, hard enough already, right? But if you actually do write even a bit of documentation, there is just no chance of this pattern library being out of date, right? Just because you build it this way. And then you create things like this, like with atoms, molecules, and so on and so forth, automatically, with every single deploy, every single commit, right? And obviously, again, you need to provide cool, proper names that everybody knows what these components are, right? Which really encourages consistency. Now, there is one problem with this kind of pattern libraries, of course, and the problem is, well, they contain HTML, CSS, JavaScript snippets. So we had a project where we had 2 teams located differently in different places. One was in Berlin, working on the core product, and they had another team in Spain working on a sub-product. Now, they are sharing some of the code base, but that team in Spain basically just went to a pattern library, copy-pasted CSS, HTML, and JavaScript into their project, right? That team in Berlin was working on the core product for a year, has improved it, has refactored it, has changed it significantly. So 1 year later, we end up with 2 different snapshots of the same code, right? One in Berlin, which is up to date, and one in Spain, which is totally not up to date. So in the end, the team in Spain had to do a redesign. Can we fix it? Well, we can. That's not that difficult. We just need to turn a static pattern library into a dynamic pattern library API. So the idea being, well, instead of actually copy-pasting the code, let's have an API call and get what we need every single time we deploy a commit, when we have a build process, right? So we say, hey, hello API, I need a search component with a label search. Please output the up-to-date version of that snippet, right? And it can be obviously customizable. So if you need something more advanced, like autocomplete, well, you can get autocomplete as well, right? So it can be really, really sophisticated. In fact, Lonely Planet is using it, and they open sourced it too, right? It's called Rizzo. So if you're looking into something like this to create a dynamic pattern library API, you can actually use that one. It's really, really cool. And you can even go a little bit further. For example, by using tools such as Theo, I think it's called Theo, which is really unbelievable. So let's assume you have a responsive site, but also an Android app, an iOS app, and maybe Microsoft whatever app, right? So what if you define a config file, which we could call as the ultimate source of truth? This is how they call it, right? One config file, which contains information about the typeface, about the colors, pretty much like pattern library, but on a meta level, if you like, right? And then what it does is it outputs all the different files, like styling files, be it CSS, be it specific Android styling or whatever, and so on and so forth, in the format that you need, right? Because of course CSS has different units than, let's say, Android apps, right? They have this DP something, I'm not sure, right? So what if you had this one file, and it would automatically, whenever you change it, update all of those code bases, right? And this is exactly the idea behind Theo, which runs on Gulp. But it's really, really good. They call it design properties, kind of naming design properties. If you're looking into if you have a corporate settings or really many companies or many teams working together, this will be invaluable. It's a really, really great tool. And if you're working with a designer and developer together, if designer and developer working together, then what could be really also useful is this tool called page layers. because you always end up with this problem with a mismatch between Photoshop mockup and the prototype, right? So you might be designing the visual experience and the visual components, but then when you start prototyping, you want to adjust the margins or the paddings or something when you put it in the context, right? Now, if you're using page layers, this problem does not exist anymore. How many of you know it, actually? Now, this is the best day of your life. And I mean it. I mean, if you're a designer, you will love it. So the point behind page layers is the following. You can, at any given time, you can actually type in an URL, be it local address or external, doesn't matter. You can select a breakpoint of your choice. And what tool does is it exports an actual HTML, CSS document into a Photoshop mockup, right? With all the divs being layers or becoming layers in Photoshop, right? So if a visual designer wants to fix something but can't really show it in CSS or using CSS or HTML in the browser, they can just quickly export it into Photoshop, adjust all the layers, and then show it to the developer, right? And then obviously it's not something you have to maintain. You just show something and then you throw it away again. So you don't even have to maintain a Photoshop file because you can just export your prototype any given time, right? Isn't it awesome? That's pretty cool, right? So you don't really have to actively maintain both of them. So this really helps saving time. Kind of running out of time, but I'm almost finished. And the last thing you can do, of course, you have to do, is that in most scenarios, it's not just a new project that you have to design or build. It's very often a responsive redesign, right? Most of my projects, approximately, I think, 65–70% are redesigns. So in that case, what do? Well, you actually follow exactly the same idea, exactly the same thing. Just before you actually start designing those components, you do an interface inventory. Because if you see things like this in an interface, as you actually go from a page to page, this is scary. Because I don't know if I push this button, will it explode or not, right? I'm not a control freak, but I like to have things under control, right? So this doesn't feel like control to me at all. I need consistency. So we actually, before we do redesign, we actually go through the pages, take screenshots, tag them with Evernote, and group them, right? To get an idea, do we need 4 different Learn More buttons? Or do we need 1? Or maybe we need 2, but then they probably need to look different, right? So we're just trying to make sense of it all. And then we actually go ahead and design as we actually did, right? With the visual design with the new components first, and then doing the rest. So just to sum up, because I'm getting weird signs from all kinds of places, just to sum up, basically, what is the workflow? Well, it's not going to work for each of you, but it might give you some inspiration of what to do and what not to do. Now, I've seen it really boosting performance. Not because I don't like Photoshop. Well, to be honest, I don't like Photoshop. But not because I don't like Photoshop, mostly because we spent way too much time in the past doing these Photoshop mockups that would never see the light of day. They would never get released, right? The design would never get released. So instead, you start thinking small. You design these components, molecular components first. They don't have to be very small. They could be quite large. As you saw, we have something like desktop size design, right, first. Then as you have enough components, you actually go ahead and start thinking about performance budgets, UX budgets, this kind of thing. And then as you start prototyping, you pick a page, an important page, and you take the components you have and you start prototyping them mobile first, right? And this is where you start defining your breakpoints and the grid and so on and so forth. And then you do this, what all crazy people do, right? And you actually grow your design from small to big, right? And this is how a page emerges. And then over time, you can actually reuse this foundation that you just built for all the kind of different pages as well. So that in the end, what we ended up doing in 60s or 70s is not much different from what we have to do today. I just think that it's really much more complex and requires much more time, but it's still manageable, right? And this is just a good checklist to keep in mind. You can just take a photo and call it a day, I think, right? So with that in mind, thank you for your attention, and looking forward to conversations we're going to have afterwards.